Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our November ACLS webinar. We are starting a two-session series about church design. So today is Trends in Church Design from 1950 to the present. And then in January, we will be doing Orthodox church design. Over the past 75 years, especially following Vatican II, church architecture has undergone significant changes across Catholic and Protestant traditions. This presentation by three ACLS member architects will explore 6 key areas shaping current church design: nave variations, arts and iconography, adoration chapels, gathering spaces, technology, and diversity and inclusion. Our presenters today are Paul Barribeau, Senior Project Manager of the Religious Studio at Growth Design Group in Cedarburg, Wisconsin; Brian Foust, founder of Foust Architecture in San Francisco; and Paul May, Architect and Principal with Miller Dunwitty in Minneapolis.
Well, I will start us off here. So thank you all for joining us. As Pam had mentioned, we're going to be talking about design trends from the 1950s on. And as you can imagine, this could be, hours long seminar, which we do not have. So we've taken it and we whittled it down to a couple of key things: plan variants, minimalism, the use of adoration chapels, gathering spaces and narthex, technology changes that have happened over the decades, and dignity and diversity incorporating into the church spaces as well. And so we're going to kind of tag team this a little bit and take various ones of these. And again, there's a lot more that could be talked about, but we're just trying to focus in on these couple of items, and we hope that this gives you some useful information as a broad history and the overview of things that have changed. So to kick that off, we'll talk about plan variants first.
Thank you, Brian. Yeah, plan variants. Let's move to the next slide. One of the things we talked about it since 1950 to the present, but I wanted to go backwards a little bit on the church plan design. As shown here, a traditional nave plan that started really from the 3rd century up through Vatican II was very boxy, but it was had a main basilican plan, which at the end would have an apse, which is generally curved, and a bema. And these arose from both the Second Temple Judaism as well as Roman basilica design. But an interesting thing to think about is the entry area, which is a courtyard, outdoor space. And the little sketch there that shows typical an outdoor space moving into the main nave, and very axial, very straightforward plan. Next slide. This shows an example of it. This is actually a Cistercian church from about 1200. And again, it has this very similar plan that we have, straightforward. They actually originally didn't even have pews, but had people would stand, and then pews were added. But you can see focus on the bema, focus on the altar, focus on the cross, at this point, starting out, very minimal liturgical art or stained glass. Next slide. An interesting thing, fast forward to late 1800s, and this is not a Catholic design, but many of the various holiness movements, Great Awakenings, Second Great Awakenings, changed the thought or the idea of worshiping in a straight axial plan to one of more of an auditorium. And so this is 1880 in America, maximizing the seating. And as they often said, it was the tent meeting that moved indoors. And so it became more of a centralized focus where the speaker was at the front, but wrapping around fan seating, as many of you will see in more recent church design. Next slide. A current example of this, and this is a church I had done up here in Minnesota, a suburb of Minneapolis. But again, a auditorium shape, maximizes the seating. You can get really close to the speakers, you can get really close to the stage, but it is a focus on the stage. You don't have the altar isn't there. You don't have the podium would be lifted up and brought up, focus on the stage. And as Brian will talk about a little bit later, very production and technology oriented. But again, picking up on plans that have been around for almost 200 years, from the auditorium shape as one variation. Next slide. But really a focus, as we talked about the trends in church design, was really post-World War II architecture. Many things. This is, Vatican II was in 1962, 63, but there were already some changes in design prior to that, heavily influenced by the modernist movement after the war. As we highlighted here, this is Rochemp, 1952, a very asymmetrical plan. And also the elements, the tabernacle, the altar, and the ambo are moving around. They are not axial. They are not coming right from the end. They are not lined up from where you enter. You can see from the plan, you enter off the left side, then you turn, and the seating is asymmetrical. The sanctuary is in the center, but the ambo is over to this left. Really very fluid design. So this kind of led up to many of the things that were formalized in Vatican II. Next slide. A church that everyone recognizes, this is St. John's Abbey in Collegeville, Minnesota. Again, it's post-World War II, and does have an axial plan, but it also has a bit of the fan shaping you can see from what we have here. And it also has the seating around it. It's a monastery, so you have the antiphonal seating for the monks surrounded by the altar and the ambo are in the center, focused with the monastic area, and then the visitors and the congregation, the parish, would be out in the fan-shaped seating, leaving this. Next slide. Another, after post-Vatican II, many things started changing in here. A lot more flexibility in where things were oriented. This is a church I worked on in Minneapolis, where it was originally a shoebox shape, and then we changed it to antiphonal seating, and the altar got moved right into the center of the space. The choir is at one end, and the baptismal font is at the other end. Next slide. Final trend that is occurring most recently is going back to more a traditional design. This is a church we're working on in a suburb of Minneapolis, St. Joachim and Anne, and really working toward a more classical ornament, more classical shape in the plan, very axial, straightforward, focus on the altar. Again, the altar is in an apse at the end of the central aisle. And another thing, as we'll get into in just a second, the reintroduction of more liturgical art. Next slide.
Great. Well, I'll take it over from here. So one of the trends that has been happening just very broadly is minimalism as we move kind of into the modern time frame. And so again, kind of looking back a little bit, kind of historically, churches, we've used a lot of stone and masonry. We've had a lot of stained glass, which is usually done very intricately to tell stories, typically scriptural stories that are on the walls that could be used for teaching and whatnot. And the linear organization of the seating was really emphasized as well, kind of everybody in a line, kind of looking towards the same direction. We also would have a lot of intricate details carvings of statues and stone, as you can see here. You can see the starburst kind of sun ray going up in that upper one as well. This is kind of historically kind of what we've seen in churches where they have a lot of money and they can do these sort of things over time and make things very beautiful. But in kind of the modern side and with this minimalism, we have a lot of stripping back of a lot of those things. So in particular, we have more diverse materials that are being used. We see the introduction of more wood. We have brick. We have precast concrete, which is well, it's not exactly modern. They use it in Roman times, but using it much more often today as a modern building material. And as Paul talked a little bit earlier, we see seating layouts begin to change. I think mostly directed towards getting people better views towards the altar table, but we see round or fan shapes or U-shape seating begin to take more of a dominance here. We still have stained glass. It still makes its way into churches and artwork, but we also see a very simplification of that. So rather than intricate scenes perhaps of scripture, we see things kind of become a little bit more abstract. You might just have a colored glass pane or maybe an abstract image as opposed to, again, the detailed stained glass. And we also have a simplifications of details, maybe fewer statues and fewer carvings. Now you might typically see them only on, say, the altar, the ambo, and kind of key liturgical areas. But it doesn't mean we don't have beauty. It doesn't mean we don't have detail. You can see in color version of Ranchamp here, you know, there's still thought and intention on what's going on and what's happening, but there's less of it happening overall. And so I wanted to share this slide as well. Kind of, you can kind of see things sort of side by side. You know, in the upper left-hand corner, you have two rooms that are round. They both have light coming from up above, but they're very different in terms of the seating. They're very different in terms of the material that's being used, but still kind of, you know, there's an echo there that you can see. In the upper right hand, you see a modern church with, again, high windows, light coming up from high, and you see the Gothic cathedral there. Very similar, very axial, but just simplified, done slightly differently. And then in the bottom images as well, you see thought and intention of detail, but just done in a different way. So that gives you a little bit of some of the trends towards simplification and minimalism over the years.
So I'll be speaking next about Adoration Chapels. Next slide. So as Brian May alluded to earlier, the tabernacle post Vatican II was moved from a more traditional spot directly behind the altar. When I started my practice, it was not uncommon to have separate chapels, sometimes connected to the worship space, sometimes allowed to be someplace entirely different within the building. Over the years, the tabernacle has moved in many places back to its original spot behind the altar. And with that, devotional space connected to it has also moved. In this case, this church, the tabernacle is directly behind the altar. And this congregation employed a devotional chapel for prayer, and with the tabernacle then in the chapel with a cross in between the altar and the tabernacle. And next slide. And then with some openness so that people can use this area for devotion and prayer, but it still is fully visible, although screened to some extent from the congregation. Next slide. Many churches now are desiring a perpetual adoration chapel, which in a renovation, the upper left-hand corner is a before-after. This is a church in northern Wisconsin. The renovated space in the lower image directly under it changed how the seating worked and the overall aesthetics, but the most dramatic change was trying to incorporate perpetual adoration. In an existing space, that's often very difficult. The tabernacle is directly behind the altar. This church had a parenting room off to the side that can still be used for parenting, but it was then transformed into a place where 24 hours a day, people could come for perpetual adoration. Next slide. And from that room, now equipped with flexible seating, kneelers, they are able to see the tabernacle through the glass that previously afforded parents the opportunity of looking into the sanctuary. This was allowed because, easy to allow because there was in fact an exterior door relatively close to this space. Next slide. We also see churches that have secondary chapels being built. This is an existing church from the 1960s in the metropolitan area of Milwaukee, desiring a chapel for perpetual adoration, but with no room available anywhere close to the tabernacle directly behind the altar. That led to us creating a separate chapel connected to the building. In this case, a chapel that in the very austere and dark architecture of the 1960s building was able to be seen as a beacon of light and a place to draw attention, an opportunity to draw attention to the church. Next slide. The plan of that shows some of the challenges associated with creating a separate chapel. Needing to have a separate entry that still connects to the church, but this chapel can be open 24 hours a day without any kind of connection to the building for security. The church debated whether to include a restroom in this chapel addition, but given the amount of time that people spend in the chapel, decided against it. And of course, we had a lobby for kind of thorough protection for the chapel itself, but also as a place that things could be stored and a book registering the people who were coming to provide that 24-hour a day perpetual adoration. Next slide. And then inside the chapel itself, these are relatively small. In this case, because it's not connected to the tabernacle that is located in the church, the chapel uses a monstrance, and then the host is visible and present 24 hours a day. Next slide. I think that's it. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you, Paul. We're going to transition to gathering spaces in the narthex next slide. But the gathering space, you will see it ties together many of the elements that we've already talked about. But again, I'm going to go back to some of the origins and the idea of an antechamber, the space before the main space, is as old as the Roman Basilica and the Second Temple, where you have the court of the Gentiles and you have the court of the women. And they originated as exterior courtyards. People would gather together and then go into the main nave, the main worship space, as we start and worship. Next slide. We go from old St. Peter's to many plazas, and I like to think of the origins of the gathering space as really the town square. And this on the left are a series of piazzas or plazas, most of them from Italy, where you find that they are the center of town, the town square, where around your piazza are all of the elements that are part of the community. So they're a central community gathering space by which you would be in the piazza, and then you could go into the church, you could go into the library, you could go into the the restaurant buildings. You could go into the buildings of government and offices. And so it was the space in town where community gathered before you went into a particular function. It also was the space that you would cross to go from one function to the other. You leave church to go have um, dinner or to go have lunch after mass, and that transitioned into church design. The lower photo here, Copley Square is an American example of it. If you've ever been there in Boston, where Copley Square Trinity Church is there, right behind this image is the library. To the left is, or behind it, the church is the McKim, Mead and White library, and then there are art galleries and there are office buildings adjacent to it. Next slide. How this has worked in contemporary church design, and this is a Protestant church, Willow Creek, outside of Chicago. And again, this shows just a huge example of it as being the space that ties together everything else. So you come in, some people call it a mall, where this is the space that you walk through, and as you, on one side is the coffee bar, and another area is where your children get dropped off for nursery. You can enter into the worship center. You can go visit the ministers in their offices. There's oftentimes a school associated with it. There's oftentimes the youth room, gymnasium, library, and other community spaces. Again, a faith community is exactly that, a community that has all things that would be available in an old Italian piazza town square, so that you can basically have all the things that you need on a Sunday or any other day of the week right there at one place. Next slide. In Catholic church design, this was a church I worked on in North St. Paul, where the gathering space is in the, I guess, the salmon colored area. You enter from the parking lot to the right-hand side. You pass by the administrative offices, the priest's offices. You pass by the shop for the store for Catholic elements, scapulars, and things like that. You enter into the gathering space, and in this case, this is where the font is. And moving straight forward was where the Adoration Chapel is, the daily chapel, and behind this photograph is where the new church is. So everything ties into the gathering space. It's where people enter, formalize as a community before they go into mass, before they go into the daily mass, and before they go get cookies and donuts and things like that as well. Next slide. Another Catholic church, ground up Catholic church, is up in northern Minnesota, here in Princeton, where the gathering space is long and linear. And rather than enter the gathering space as the first slide was at the beginning, the gathering space is off center to the main church. But it does connect the Adoration Chapel, the daily chapel, to the lower left center that Paul had talked about earlier. The main church, the blue area, are all of the offices. Social hall is in the green, and on the right-hand side is the full gymnasium for youth and for community events. Again, the gathering space is a place that you walk through and has an informal quality to it, but you can see where it has, just by pure size, has changed so much from what would be the traditional narthex, where there would be very small transition space. This is quite large, probably I would say 5 to 10 times the size of some of the narthexes that we've seen in our early Catholic church design. Off to you, Brian.
Great. So next we want to talk a little bit about technology. This has been one of the interesting things to me that's changed over the years and continues to change, and has quite a bit of impact on the space requirements and kind of what we see and do. And so obviously, traditionally, if you have, say, a Catholic cathedral, we have hard stone surfaces. It's great for kind of live vocal acoustics. That's why you get those kind of great singing and choir going on in there. But in kind of more modern churches, we have the introduction of amplification. And so with amplification comes wiring and mics and speakers. And as you can see from this example that I've shown here, we have some very large speakers hung up on a wall that have been discreetly covered by white sheets, so that they are hardly noticeable anymore. So this is kind of the early stages of amplification and people working with what they had to kind of make that happen. But over the years, it's gotten a lot better. And so you can see in this example, I've also highlighted in red, you can kind of see the little white bar. I don't know, I call these Bose speakers because that's who we bought ours from. But you can see it's starting to become a little bit more discreet, and you can put it into the space and have a little less visual impact on what's going on. So that's one of the great things about the technology. As they continue to work on it, things get smaller and smaller. And then down to this is the cathedral in LA. At first glance, you might not even think that there is any sound amplifications or speakers going on here, but all of the lighting, there's these kind of little almost trumpet looking things in the middle of it, and there's speakers embedded into those. And so now you have, through the kind of technology getting smaller and smaller and better, you have an integration of the technology into the art, into the lighting that just makes things much less obtrusive, spreads the sound throughout for a much more even experience and the ability to hear. So that's been a great evolution with regards to sound over the years. Another thing we have is we have a lot more use of projection screens or TVs in spaces. And these are great in terms of helping people follow along with the liturgical action of what's happening. You can see all the text in front of you, engaging in songs and whatnot. But it also offers a bit of an intrusiveness. And so you can see in this picture here, the screen is put up in a central location where everyone can see it, but it's hiding some of the artwork that's behind it. And so that's one of the things we need to think through in terms of sight lines and kind of what's going on in spaces as we look at projection and TVs. We also have cameras and lighting going on in some of the more evangelical churches. This also offers some great things in terms of with social media and streaming. You can stream a service beyond the walls of the church. My brother-in-law's church does this, which is great for the older folks in the congregation who can't make it into the Sunday sermon because of health reasons and whatnot. They get to participate in a sense, kind of virtually. But this offers a whole nother layer of technology that needs to be coordinated and thought through with IT and cables and mics. And now you need a little bit of a control room where the stuff can be managed and handled. You'll also need to think about another form of lighting that is controlling what's going on versus just natural lighting and other accent lighting that you might have. You also need to think through camera locations and what does the view of a camera have? Is it obscured? Is it blocked? So not just people being able to view, but how does the camera view the space as well? So that's another trend that's coming along with technology in churches.
So on to dignity and diversity. Next slide. So we have had churches, I have seen churches struggle with how to embrace and accommodate the breadth of human condition, physical, spiritual, mental, and I'd like to hold up 4 different conversations that churches wrestle with and try to find solutions for. Next slide. First is just physical ability. This is actually an old project. John Bashem was the liturgical consultant on this project, and this church set before their architectural team challenge to make the primary path of travel between entry and altar through font, nave, and to the sanctuary, fully accessible in a way that the main path of travel would not be, would limit people with physical abilities. And we did that primarily through very gradual slopes, ramps. They aren't officially ramps. One of the things that we find, many codes now require a certain amount of accessibility in their buildings with new spaces, and in most cases, retrofitting existing spaces to be fully compliant. But the code is a minimum, and churches struggle with how to fully embrace making their buildings fully accessible in the way that Robert Habiger, one of our members, would call equivalency. And I have actually found it very helpful to talk about dignity in these conversations. Next slide. We've also seen trends regarding the outfitting of hospitality space. My generation and the generations before me used the main dining facility. The paradigm for that might have been the VFW or the supper club. Seeing a resurgence in some areas, and churches set up their fellowship spaces to accommodate what was the norm for the society around them. This is a renovated space, actually a former nave that, with the building of a new building, turned their existing nave into a fellowship hall. Next slide. And we're even seeing more casual and contemporary types of hospitality and dining spaces. This is from a church that essentially adopted the language of coffee house and places that younger generations hang out. And all of this is to make the hospitality spaces that are encountered alongside their worship familiar and appealing to younger generations and to what are familiar hangout spaces in our society. Next slide. We're also seeing churches wrestle with how to respond to cultural differences and to multicultural sensibilities. This is a chapel project that I will be presenting a webinar on in the next year. A renovation. This is a 1990s chapel space at a university that has a very diverse population, and the intent of the chapel was to not have overt religious symbolism. Next slide. So as we looked to symbol that would be less overtly Christian to be able to accommodate people outside that faith, we looked to other symbols and decided that the mandorla, which is an ancient Christian symbol, but less familiar to the majority of people in our society, and is akin to lotus or mandala, would become the predominant symbol in the renovation of this chapel. Next slide. And so you can see the original concepts of the space, incorporated the mandorla in the ceiling, and the space was initially designed with no overt Catholic symbol. If you tune in for the webinar next year, you'll find out how that changed over the course of the design of the chapel. Not for better or for worse, just very different. Next slide. We've seen the incorporation of cultures that are more diverse than traditional Catholic settings. This is a church that was built in the 1950s for a predominantly white Mass, and they incorporated basically the sensibilities of a pipe organ, and the church in modern times transitioned to a predominantly African American congregation. Next slide. And the renovation of that space then dramatically changed the acoustics of the space, the color palette of the space to represent the more familiar African colors of the African American community, and incorporated art that also embodied both African American saints and African American art. Next slide. And we see that most represented in their font, which used river language in the design of the font, because the predominant people that were joining the church and becoming members in the surrounding community had Pentecostal backgrounds. And the artwork also echoed this in the quilts that were used for the Underground Railroad, bringing people from slavery in the South to freedom in the North. Next slide. And finally, struggling with language. There's no real good way of getting away from the need to put signs in churches, but we have found over the years, we have looked to branding from corporate projects that really convey the same sort of intention of directing people to specific things, in this case, male and female restrooms, using symbol rather than text. Next slide. And we've also found the use of art to be very helpful in creating a way to get around the hurdle of language barriers. So art continues to be a way of articulating our spaces in a way that brings richness and meaning without necessarily relying simply on language that can be a barrier for many people. I think that is the last of my slides.
Brian, do you want to unshare the screen so that we can see everyone?
Yep.
So we have trends going from simple to more ornate, and then simple again. But also there's a movement in the church to be ornate again. So it seems like we vacillate, simple, ornate, simple, ornate. Can you comment on that?
I can start out. That's been happening since, over the centuries, when even when the Catholic Church got very highly ornamented, Luther came around. Well, even the Cistercians came around and said, let's remove the ornament. Let's get back to the basics. Sermon on the Mount, you can be outside, and you don't need a facility that churches the people. Comes back in Renaissance and Baroque, and then Luther comes and strips it down and says, let's get back to a more minimalist. We could talk about shaker architecture. We could talk about things like that. And so I think we're just doing another series of that. But I think we also find that there are opportunities for each of us in our faith walk in there to find a parish or a church where we thrive, because the variety exists. And I think that's a good sign.
Mm-hmm.
I think from my perspective, one of the things that I see in our churches isn't necessarily a move from, there have been trends that moved away from art within religious space, but there is always a need within the human community to have things that engage our senses and speak to the gospel message through art and things that we encounter in our architecture. And so I think the focus may change and the ornamentation may change, but the intricacy of the spaces and the way that they engage people with light, with color, with art, with texture and story is just an ongoing conversation of how we do that. And some of the things that are new are, of course, technology and the ability to do different things with how that message gets conveyed. But I don't think the experience is necessarily one of removing things that people can be tangibly connected to.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I would add is, over the years we've had the kind of revival movements of people looking back and saying, "Oh, we want to do that again," but they don't do it in quite the same way. There's different technologies and whatnot that are integrated into it, and there's a new expression of that thing that looks to the past. And so it'll be interesting, 30, 50 years from now, as people look back at like, oh, we went from simplification to back to more decoration, but how is that decoration different from the decoration that they did previously? It'll be interesting to see what actually comes of that.
And I think the challenge can be uh, how that technology either serves the church or doesn't. There were many churches in the 1950s and 60s that essentially deadened their spaces acoustically in order to incorporate technology with microphones and speakers that were supposed to be the greatest and best thing for the worship experience. And I have spent a good part of the last 30 years undoing that work and restoring the natural acoustic to the space, because technology has a place, but it can't do what architectural acoustics can do. So I think there is always this danger of trying something that is new, testing it, and then the years following that, really evaluating it to understand where it has succeeded or failed. And then the church architecture responds to the success or failure of the incorporation of new thought.
Gilbert, did you have a question?
I did. I appreciate the presentation, but it reminds me of some of the struggles I've had in my own kind of presentations. Right, we're trying to educate, especially let's say a design committee or the whole parish, on the historical nature of the church, and it's not an easy task. And I'm beginning to wonder if we have too many variations of what's considered historical facts. And I worry that because I run this into this in my own, in my own practice, that, people are like, well, that's not what I understand from sacred architecture of Notre Dame, their magazine or something. And I'm like, well, that's great, but they're kind of slanted on a specific issue, and so I worry that when we present, especially on historical sense, that we don't have a good, I think, authoritative source, or if we do, it's not quite clear. And I'm kind of wondering if maybe a future webinar is looking at kind of authoritative sources that we can use, especially as we're presenting. And not that anything was necessarily really wrong with anything that was said, but there are things that I could see where somebody would say or challenge this and say, well, wait, no, that's not right. This isn't what I remember from church history class that I had, or an art history class and stuff like that. And so it just, to me, the whole webinar actually presents this challenge of how do we educate, make it accessible to a community that may or may not have a large historical background, but then also make sure that it's accurate enough to withstand the complaints. So I just throw that out there, wondering how the panelists, as you were trying to prepare for this, how you prepared for this, and then how did you, or did that emerge in your own struggle? Because I'd imagine, I mean, if I was asked to be on this panel, I think I would struggle with having to make sure that that accuracy is correct.
Well, I'll start out. In part, it's mixing different denominations, which approach things a little differently. And if we chose not to focus solely on Catholic design, that was in our experience as well. But I have actually a little. I was at a speaker one time that broke things down into fads, trends, and principles. And he said, you play with fads, you work with trends, which is what we were talking about, but you live by principles. And I think, Gilbert, you might have said, if we started with the principles and then work backwards from that, then you can see how trends reflect that and how other elements like that go through time.
Yeah, I think too, it's hard. I understand what you're saying there, Gilbert, where you have a limited amount of time to have a conversation about 2,000 years of history, you know, and so you have to pick and choose at some point, and so it's hard to know. Some of that might be knowing your audience in terms of if you're talking to a building committee, and where might they be coming at it from one of these issues, so you can kind of zero in and focus on, you know, the accuracy or the approach that they might be taking for something that might be helpful as a way of thinking through how do you try to take that 2,000 years down into a, you know, this is an hour-long conversation. In a meeting with a client, you might be trying to have that conversation in 10 minutes, you know? So it's a little different, it's very difficult.
Any more comments, questions?
We need more art historians and architectural historians in consultancy.
Mm-hmm.
Marilyn? Unmute.
I can. I have a question about technology, and I'm wondering, sometimes technology falls into the fad realm where, you know, it's new and we've got to do it. And, you know, one question is, how do you balance the technology with natural lighting? Which, you know, they want a lot of natural light, and how do you do the technology, and how do you put the technology in so it's not distracting? You know, like what kind of education would you employ that it's advantageous yet not, you don't go to watch a screen. So how do you use it to enhance the liturgy but not detract from the liturgy?
Yeah, I think one of the things about the technology is things change so quickly that you could take a project where you might install something and like, oh, we've got the latest thing, and then 2 years later it's obsolete because there's something better. You mentioned screens and screens and natural lighting. I working on a project. It's not necessarily church related, but they wanted to have a screen with a menu on it outside, and I'm like, oh, how are you going to make that work? But found out that they have actual TVs that are designed to go outside and can deal with the glare of that. They didn't have that like a couple of years ago. So it is weird. Like, I wouldn't want to say it's a fad, but the technology changes so quickly that you might be investing a lot of money in something that there's a better solution just a couple of years later to help you mitigate some of that stuff.
Can I speak? Thank you for your presentation. You know, I think, like Paul Barribeau said, I feel like my stained glass has actually been following the 60s and the 50s, and also had the same struggle, you know, of trying to rectify what was intended to be new, and then actually was perhaps primitive in its start, in its, or you know, beginnings. And so, you know, in the 70s, late 80s, 90s, we were actually redoing a lot of those kind of primitive beginnings. And I would say, you know, that I was on the board of Faith and Form, and we went to a lot of evangelical churches and gave talks. But I would say that a lot of what you're presenting as new is based on a lot of what they've done. And I questioned it only because, for me, you know, all of the new technology, or the screens, and not the sound and all of that, but you know, I feel like when we go to, you know, a meditation or church space, it's to get aligned with, you know, the Spirit of God, which is in many different forms, but is such a deep, it's such an elusive experience. And I think our work is always to find the ways that we can touch that spirit. And I mean, obviously it's different for everybody. I find for myself, it's more in a quiet space, and light is very much part of it. But and certainly it's no criticism at all of what you presented, because I think what you're presenting is what's been happening and in the church. And I think there's so many different ways of you know, of creating that. I feel, as well as this, you know, search for, you know, the presence of the Spirit, is a sense of place. And that's, I think, what, at least I would say, you know, my commissions have, with the parishes, have been seeking to do, is to somehow reflect in so many different ways, as well as connect to this tradition of the church, that unique region or sense of place that they live in. So I'm just my thoughts.
It's interesting, Elizabeth, you know, for centuries, right? The churches were struggling with how to bring light into space, how to penetrate the wall, and sometimes then articulating that with color and story. The early part of my career, I ran into a lot of much more contemporary styled churches that essentially wanted to create the black box to control light and remove it completely, partly because the technology for that style of worship wanted control of artificial lighting. It's interesting to me in the last 10 years that many of those churches, with the change in technology that is less sensitive to light, that now they are calling for the expansion of light into their worship spaces, because it no longer, technology kind of solved the issue of how do we do screen and how do we do light at the same time. I think it's a moving target, but ultimately I think we create architecture that responds to the human sensory experience, and that brings fullness and beauty and nourishment to the physical being. Light is a part of that, texture, art, scale, all of those things. And every church project wrestles with that, trying to figure out how do we touch the human with the divine and within our architecture and within our art.
Gail?
I just want to add a little bit into that because as you were showing one of the slides, first of all, thank you. It was wonderful. Gave me a lot of ideas. The traditional worship space with screens having the words on them and how that is a distraction. And I think I heard Elizabeth speak a little bit to that and Paul a little bit to that because it sort of turns the room into a Zoom call instead of a worship space. And I think that's part of the struggle. But I also suspect that 200, 300 years ago, it was the same struggle with the missalette. That what are these books with words that's so distracting to our worship? We don't need the books with the words. Throw those out. And somehow we figured out a way to make those things a part of worship. I have no idea how screens are going to become a part of worship in the same sense. You know, they feel like a big white box of intrusion and print, and we haven't been able to incorporate that. I don't know how or what, but that's just my observation is that we've been on this train before. We just don't know how they did it to solve the problem, and we have another problem, another challenge. Thoughts? Just my thought.
It's always interesting
Well,
how the church wrestles, right, with the things that our society brings to the table, trying to incorporate it and make it useful, but erring maybe in figuring out how to make it become a useful tool rather than something that is in fact less helpful for connecting people to people and people to divine, which is ultimately why we're creating worship spaces to begin with, right? And I suspect that both our architectural toolbox and our technological toolbox and the things that art is able to do will always struggle with how to be relevant and how to create that environment in a way. I mean, I have been in spaces where the art was a distraction more than a help, right? And so it's always this ongoing conversation about how our architecture connects with what is essential to the worship experience. And each community may define that worship experience differently and then tries to use architecture, art, and technology in a way that gives them the experience that they're are trying to create. It's one of the things that I think makes our job challenging, but also delightful, right? Sometimes we get it right. I mean, this is the challenge of the person at the end of a career, right? You can look back over projects and say, gosh, that was phenomenal what we did, or that was phenomenal, but it's no longer relevant, or wow, I'll never do that again.
Well, thank you, Brian, Paul, and Paul. It was a wonderful presentation today, and wishing everyone a happy Thanksgiving, Merry Christmas, Happy New Year, and we will see you back here in the third week of January.